Uh, Good morning and welcome everyone to the podcast. Today we are doing a collaboration with the Center for Political Economy and Philosophy at Jindal Global University. And I'm joined by my co-host Ramanan Malika, and I'll be interviewing today Professor Pervez Hoodbhoy. Before starting this conversation, let me introduce Professor Hoodbhoy. Professor Hoodbhoy is a Pakistani nuclear physicist and human rights activist who has written on a variety of topics, including religion, science, the contemporary state in Pakistan, and has done much for popularization of science, having won the Kalinga Award and multiple awards. Who was named one of the top 100 global thinkers by the Foreign Policy magazine. Professor Hoodbhoy, it's an honor to have you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So today I want to start by talking to you about your most recent book, which is Pakistan, Origins, Identity, and Future. Uh, I wanted to ask you what led you to write this book at this particular time, because it is in multiple ways a historical tour de force and goes deep into the ideas and philosophies of the founders of Pakistan, which, as we will discuss, I'm sure, in this conversation, is not very coherent.
Well, there were two reasons. One was that I don't see honest accounts of Pakistani history, and historians who are on in universities in history departments, they tend to write only that narrative which assures their promotion and their survival, perhaps. And this being an ideological state by its own narrative, insists that history be as they were taught, as the state wants. So I wanted something that was independent, something that was truthful, something that was free of the lies that I had been taught when I was in school, and which I see is being taught day after day in our schools, colleges, and universities. So that was one thing. The other was that there's no coherent history of Pakistan that starts from way back in the past, goes through partition, and ends at the present moment. And then I wanted to throw in a little bit more. What is it that makes the Pakistani identity? Is there a Pakistani identity, or is there one that will emerge in the future? And so here also is a little bit about the future. What's the future of Pakistan going to be like, given that it's so embroiled in crises at the present time? So these were two outstanding reasons that I wanted to. But look, let me also tell you a third reason, which is that I wanted to find out for my own self a lot of things that I'd heard and felt queasy about. I knew that they couldn't be absolutely right. So then I went into the historical literature, into the academic literature, and looked for myself and went to the original sources as well. So it was a process of self-discovery as well. But I'd say that the first reason was the most important. I wanted an honest account of history, which was comprehensive as well.
Do you expect your account, though, to be read by the masses of Pakistan? Because certainly it's not going to be read, it's not going to be promoted by the government. So the only way for them to find out about it is to other means. And you have written previously about, the dearth of book culture in Pakistan as a whole.
Oh, that's a very good point. There is a dearth of book culture. And so, as a substitute, what I do is I give talks on this wherever I am allowed to speak on it. Most recently, I was at LUMS, but then the book was launched in Karachi, in several places in Karachi. I've talked about it in Lahore, I've talked about it in Islamabad, and had a 16-part discussion that was in English on the book, chapter by chapter, with a friend in Karachi, and that's on my YouTube channel. So it's an oral culture. People don't read very much, and that really is why I think minds haven't opened enough in Pakistan. The more you read, the better it is, the greater the variety of subjects, of topics that one is exposed to. And I don't think there's a substitute for reading, but still, okay, if people don't read, then at least they listen. And so that is the hope.
So I wanted to start by talking about the three founders of Pakistan, which you go into great detail about. Uh, we'll go chronologically, but since you mentioned LUMS, it's ironic because not that long ago, the university that I study in, Jindal Global University, had a collaboration for exchange to students from LUMS. So our students would go there and their students would come here. And it was just 5 years ago, I guess. So ironic that, political causes has created, such grave borders. But keeping that aside, about Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who you argue is more, who I think, based on your assessment, seems to be more well known in India than Pakistan. He's more eulogized in India than Pakistan because he is a household name in India, and we see him in our textbooks. We see him, of course, there is the Aligarh Muslim University. He's repeatedly talked about, although his ideas are not talked about, but he as a figure is talked about. Where you emphasize on how little attention is given or his ideas are given in Pakistan. So why is that so?
Well, that's a recent phenomenon. Earlier on, I mean, if you way back 40, 50 years ago, he was a central figure too. So when you had Independence Day, 14th of August, you had all three pictures adorning the newspapers. There would be Sayyid Ahmad Khan, there would be Allama Iqbal, there would be Muhammad Ali Jinnah. But now he's been demoted. Sayyid Ahmad Khan has been demoted because well, he doesn't quite fit into the Islamist mold. That's primary. After all, he was a rationalist, and some of his ideas were positively dangerous and despised then and today by those who are religiously orthodox. He, there's another aspect to it. He's a muhajir. Well, sorry, he isn't a muhajir, but he's somebody from North India. And the people who migrated from North India to Pakistan after partition, they're called muhajirs in a way that resembles the migrants, the refugees who went from Makkah to Medina following the Holy Prophet Muhammad. Now, those people they were initially very powerful in Pakistan. They were the very privileged of all Pakistanis earlier on, but they have lost that position to the Punjabis. And so there's also a bit of an ethnic issue over here. By and large, I would say that Sayyid Ahmad Khan has been hugely demoted in recent decades.
So Syed Ahmad Khan starts out as a Wahhabist extremist, more or less, a dogmatic Wahhabist. And it is an encounter with Ghalib that seems to have changed more or less his views. You mentioned that early on he's writing about the motion of the earth, and he's arguing against Copernican astronomy because he believes in the Quran, and that a lot of Pakistani preachers, a lot of Islamic preachers seem to continue to argue for the same thing today.
I wouldn't say a lot, but yeah, there are a fair amount who still believe the earth is flat and the sun goes around the earth. And indeed, that's where Sir Syed Ahmad Khan started out with. And he also was, as you said, extremely Wahhabist. In fact, he wrote a 30-page paper on whether it was Islamic for Muslim to eat mangoes, because there were no mangoes in Saudi Arabia, of course, in Makkah, Medina. And of course, this is something that Prophet Muhammad probably never ate. And so it's not right to eat mangoes. So he was indeed extremely orthodox. But then I don't think it was just this encounter with Ghalib. Ghalib was an influence on him. Of course, that's true. But I think it was Syed Ahmad Khan's proximity to the British that primarily did it. That he saw how powerful they were. He saw that they had transformed the globe, they had taken over India with just a few thousand Englishmen. And he said, hey, where the hell is all this power coming from? And then he realized it's modern learning, it's science, and so forth. And so he went pretty much the same way that Raja Ram Mohan Roy had gone 50 years earlier.
So that is, in fact, one of the things that he's often accused of by progressives and liberals, as well as the Indian right wing, that he was a British stooge, as it were. And you deal with length at this question, coming to the conclusion that he was more pragmatist than a dogmatic supporter of the British.
Yeah, look, here it's a question of how you choose to describe him. Yeah, you could call him a stooge. That is what a lot of Pakistanis also call him. Just like Hindutva, the Orthodox Muslim over here in Pakistan will say that he was just an agent of the British. And in fact, he wrote against the 1857 War of Independence and said, he wrote a track called Asbab-e-Baghawat-e-Hind. Baghawat is rebellion. Baghi is a rebel, not a good person. And he, in fact, gave reasons for why, and he essentially tried to whitewash the British and say that it's just a few bad Muslims who were rising up against them. So, yes, you could call him a stooge. On the other hand, you could say that he was a pragmatist. He saw that there's no way that the British are going to leave India. Remember that this is 1857. That is about something like 90 years before partition actually happened. And so so Britain then was a colossus. There's no way that you could think that the British would ever go away from India. And said, let's serve them, let's get advantages from them. And he wanted advantages both for Muslims and Hindus. But the Muslim and Hindu elite, not for the ordinary man. He despised the ordinary man, and he despised Bengalis. So it's a very peculiar mix of a man that you have over there. And one of the purposes of my looking at Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was just to show what a complex character he was, and how the circumstances of his time made him into this incredibly he led to an incredibly convoluted philosophy. Now, he did take a lot of risks. So when he said the modern world requires science, well, then the modern world and the Quran don't get along very well. Science and the Quran don't get along very well at all. And so he set about the task of creating a new Muslim theology. And that's a pretty dangerous task. Of course, today it would be impossible. But there he had the protection of the British. And so what he did was such a bold reinterpretation of Muslim theology that I think it's unprecedented. It hasn't happened ever since. So, to give you an example, he said there's no such a thing as a miracle, because a miracle means that you break the laws of physics, of science. And if you do that, well, then it's God breaking his own laws. And so he argued, he said, there are miracles that the Quran talks about, that the Hadith talks about, and he actually spoke about several one of them. One was in which Prophet Muhammad looked at the moon and with the wave of his little finger split it in two. It's called Shakul Qamar. He said, didn't happen. This is just a story to tell stupid people. It just can't happen. And so, in consequence, he got fatwas calling for his death. The keeper of the Kaaba said, this is a man who should be killed. And I don't think it's true. I don't think there were 5,555 fatwas of putting him to death, but I think there were certainly a lot.
So, you mentioned how Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is among one of the rarest figures in his reconciliation of Islam uh, with modern science, because we don't see a lot of reformers like that in Islam. You mentioned, for instance, that there are more Hindu reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy than there are Islamic reformers at the same time. Why do you think that is?
Well, Islam has been on the downslide ever since modernity has came up in Europe, and that's 300 years ago. That colonialism. Now, earlier on, the Muslims were the rulers, then they became the subjects. And so this was an enormous, um, uh, uh, it hit the ego very hard. It hit the notion that Islam is the best religion in the world and that God takes care of his own people. So, in reaction to that, the one reaction to that was that of getting more and more conservative, getting more and more reactionary. The the other side was that of the modernists. Among the modernists, I won't say Sayyid Ahmad Khan is the only one. There were modernists in Turkey like Zia Gökalp, modernists in Egypt like Rashid Rida, and so forth. But none of them went as far as Sayyid Ahmad Khan. And he could do this because he was so protected by the British and felt safe. On the other hand, he had to face the Muslim community as well. So he often took a way that was sort of half here, half there. So yes, he did reinterpret Muslim theology, but then he banned his own books. They were never taught at Aligarh Muslim University or MAO College earlier.
There is, I think, part of his support to British perhaps derives from his elitism, because he was an Anabaptist elitist, as you mentioned. And the elitist uh, belonging to the old Delhi sort of culture that he belonged to did not particularly like the 1857 rebellion because it was chaotic, it was violent, and Ghalib writes a lot against it, writing about how Delhi and the old Mughal culture is being ruined by the people who are rioting in the streets. So a lot of the concerns, because this is the time where he transitioned from being a non-communalist Muslim to a communalist Muslim, and he directs his attention to the preservations of the elite. So, how much of his support for the British was motivated by simply his desire to preserve the old regime?
the it was the old regime that he wanted. Well, old regime means that the Mughal era, but that was gone. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, was an emperor just in name, and he was just a prisoner in the Red Fort, Al Qila. So I think Sayyid Ahmad Khan realized that the tide of history had changed, that Muslims must seek the protection of the British. He spoke out against self-rule, and he was actually criticized by some Muslims and also by Hindu nationalists at that time. But he never budged from his position, because he had pinned everything upon his being supported by the British, and it paid off. After all, he did become a historical character by virtue of his support for the British. But look, having said all that, and I'd say one other negative thing about him, which is that he was very anti-woman. He thought that women should. He argued for education, but education for boys and men only, not for girls and women. So in that sense, he was anti-feminist. All right. So lots of negative things to say. But on the other hand, I think he was profoundly progressive as well, in the sense of forget your old customs, go look at the new world. It's a world that's being defined by reason and logic, and he was, I think, in that sense, unique.
Yaman, go ahead.
Uh, so, taking into consideration Sir Syed Ahmed Khan's recent demotion in Pakistan's political pantheon, and as you mentioned in your book, how influence of Islamic scriptures have seeped even into, say, the education curriculum or the science curriculum in particular. What what sort of actors or forces are there in Pakistan civil society now that are to some extent offering any rationalist perspective, that are there to contend with, say, just the religious orthodoxy? And you also mentioned a lack of a book culture, so taking all of that into consideration too.
There's the lack of the book culture, but there's plenty of textbook culture. The textbook in Pakistan is heavily biased when it comes to history, but also when it comes to science and to, any kind of modern learning. I think they're very backward. And for me, it has been a fight for over the last 40 years to have the textbook boards scrapped, to have books, at least in science, that are imported, perhaps translated, also used in English, but mostly translated, and to have them translated into local languages and not just Urdu. The problem with Pakistan's education has been a very serious one. It's got more serious now that Imran Khan came, and the worst thing that Imran Khan did was to change the national curriculum and make it very much like that of the madrasas. Now, there is resistance to that, silent resistance to that. You asked who are the torchbearers of rationality? Well, I'd say you won't see many people standing up. Maybe a couple of people, maybe a handful of people. I include myself in that. But the more important thing is that there is a rational culture that's emerging, and it's because of the demands of modernity. Now, what's a student going to do learning the hadith and the Quran when he has to get a job let's say as a programmer, as a software developer. Now, no matter how many hadiths you learn, it ain't gonna do you no good. So what you need is, basic math, basic science, physics, chemistry, math, and a basic knowledge of the world around you. So kids and even college people in college, they are learning that. They know that they don't have a future if they learn the stuff that Imran Khan wants them to learn. Fortunately, the guy's in jail. Well, no, sorry, I take that back. It's bad that he's in jail. But the harm that he did was so immense. It's not that Pakistani education was good before that. He just made it. It was a wounded horse. He put a bullet through its head.
Okay. And talking about the needs of modernity, in your book, you also talked about how Pakistanis who don't live in Pakistan, who were born to Pakistani parents in, say, other countries abroad, their primary way of thinking of identity is through religion rather than just, say, through nationalism per se. But these individuals also have connections back home, as in they send money back home, and they also talk about what is their influence. They also at some point contributed to the brain drain, as you addressed it. But do they contribute in any way to the the silent rising rationalist stream?
It's a good question you ask. I was in the UK recently for a book tour, and I had the chance to go to Birmingham, East London, well, Bradford. I nearly went to have been there before. And one sees that, okay, there are two types of Pakistanis. One are those who want to create a little Pakistan for themselves, wherever they are, Bradford, Birmingham, East London, whatever, Manchester. And they want to live lives which are secluded, which are cut off from the mainstream culture. And they teach their kids in the same way that kids are taught in Pakistan. And they don't want to send them to public schools, lest they get corrupted, lest their daughters mingle with white boys or any boys. So that's the conservative Pakistani. On the other hand, there's also the Pakistani who's melded into the mainstream culture. So you see, they don't organize themselves in the same way. They don't live together. They've distributed themselves. They've essentially become part of the mainstream British culture. And so they don't want to necessarily identify themselves. They send their kids to, well, grammar schools, to public schools in the UK. They go to universities and so forth. But their numbers are relatively small. Now, in terms of the influence of expatriates on Pakistan, I'd say not really. I don't see them as exerting any kind of a major ideological influence or a thinking effect upon people over here. On the other hand, they send back large amounts of money, and that money has, well, made a difference, both positive and negative, to the economics of Pakistan. But that's a separate issue.
So I want to get back to Iqbal, the second founder. I'm particularly interested in Iqbal because, he's treated as this philosopher, poet of Pakistan, more or less like what Tagore would be to Iqbal, Tagore would be to India, Iqbal is to Pakistan. But his status as a co-founder is, you mentioned, uh, relatively relatively recent. He existed before, but it's only during Ziaul Haq's terms, during the Islamization, that he is uh, instituted as a co-founder alongside Jinnah.
Yes, that is correct. Now, Iqbal died in 1938. And so that's 9 years before Pakistan. So he can't really be a founder of Pakistan, but then nor can Syed Ahmad Khan. What did he contribute to the making of Pakistan? Well, he rallied Muslims with the notion that they were great earlier because they had been good Muslims. They had prayed, they had done whatever the Quran tells them to, and with a sword in hand, they had conquered the world. And now it's time to do that again. Now, that's the most conservative, orthodox, reactionary part of Iqbal. And
That's his most
now,
famous poem, Sikwa.
yes, and then with Jawab-e-Shikwa also. It's full of blood and gore, and I find it difficult to read for that reason. But remember that this is the same Iqbal who wrote that Sare Jahan se acha Hindustan hamara. And he actually wrote a poem praising Ram and poems for kids and so forth, very beautiful ones. He underwent a personality transformation after going to Europe, and we can speculate on that, but I think it was the humiliation he felt as a subject. He was way smarter than other students, than other people that he encountered in Cambridge, UK. But they regarded him as a subject. After all, he was a colonial subject at that time. And I think this is what caused him to look back into the past and recollect those glories of history, imagine them as well. And so when he came back, he was a very different person. And now with his being able to put the reactionary point of view, the tir, the talwar, the sword, the dagger, he played to the reactionary sentiment among Indian Muslims. And so forget about the philosophy. Although he is revered as a philosopher, yet in his own words, he despised philosophy. Now, the thing is that in Pakistan, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote this book, Iqbal is revered as a philosopher as well. And this in spite of his saying that philosophy requires you to open your mind. And if you open your mind, then all sorts of kufr, disbelief can enter. And so he said, I don't want to be a philosopher. And he writes to his sister saying that I wasted my time going to Europe and learning philosophy. But anyway, since we want to believe that he's a philosopher, he's also called a philosopher in Pakistan. And Mufakkare Mashriq, the thinker of the East. I think that's a mischaracterization of Iqbal. He was a brilliant poet. I think probably his command of the language of Urdu is unparalleled. I don't see anyone else with that depth. Not Ghalib, not Faiz Ahmad Faiz. And in fact, Faiz Ahmad Faiz bowed humbly to him. In fact, he wrote a tract praising the poetry of Iqbal, which is perfectly fair. As a poet, yes. As a thinker, no.
He also seemed to have a communist phase because there are lots of poetries that you cite where he seems to be extolling communism.
Oh, yes. In fact, in one of his poems, he says that जिस खेत से दहकां को, the field which does not yield grain to its tiller, that field should be set afire. He wrote an ode to Lenin. He was deeply impressed by the ideas of communism. But then, you see, this is among his contradictions and inconsistencies. He was, as long as he was just a poet exploring this and that and letting his thoughts go random, he was not ideological at that point. But when he entered politics, he saw what sort of poetry was needed to stir the masses. And that's the phase which General Ziaul Haq and the conservative Pakistanis really love.
And that phase came from an encounter with the West. And you made an interesting comparison of Iqbal with Syed Qutb. And Syed Qutb wrote Milestone. Syed Qutb was, of course, Bin Laden's favorite philosopher. He wrote Milestones after his stay in the West, where he receives a culture shock, and he then writes Milestone, urging Islam to rise up and uh, eradicate kufru from Islamic lands. So, in that sense, both of them have a very strong similarity. Although Syed Qutb is perhaps a more explicit Islamist thinker than Iqbal.
Yes, but Sayyid Qutb took his own words very, very seriously. And when Jamal Abdul Nasir hanged him for treason, he went to the gallows and didn't repent. On the other hand, Allama Iqbal wrote an ode to Queen Victoria, and he also accepted knighthood. Some people say that he actively campaigned for being knighted. That may or may not be true, but he certainly did like to be called Sir Allama Iqbal or Sir Muhammad Iqbal. And he never refused that, although, yeah, he could have. That was an option.
Are you saying that Iqbal was not brave enough to follow his words, to walk the talk?
He said that himself. He said, मैं गाजी मैं गुफ्तार का गाजी हूं. I am I talk. I'm not a hero.
And
But
his
you know, that sort of thing is suppressed. That is not allowed to be made well known.
his defense of faith and his critique of science in the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, written in English, which you elaborate upon, does not sound very convincing. It is sort of the same old arguments that have been used before, and I would argue that Al-Ghazali argued much better than Muhammad Iqbal, although his argument also was deeply flawed. And his instinctive dismissal of science, because science leads people to ask questions, science leads people to think deeply about the universe. Instead, he wants to be confined to the comforts and certainties of faith, which is the precise opposite of thinking.
I think you put it very well, very concisely also. And this is really the fundamental problem, that if you open your eyes too wide, then you start seeing things here and you start seeing things there and saying, hey, what I was taught Could that really be right? Now, in seeking to defend belief, in seeking to promote revelation over reason, Iqbal said science simply tells you the superficial. It tells you what you can see, but it doesn't tell you what you cannot see. And so he says the real truth lies in metaphysics. The real truth is revealed to you. It's in your own heart. Well, if that's the measure of truth, um, then certainly it must be true that Israel is the promised land for Jews, because they know it is true, because their heart tells them it is true. And so it must be true. Now, if one believes in that in the heart alone, then reason is then just put at the peripheries, is there for helping you make your cars, your bicycles, your spacecraft, or whatever. And it's just a tool, nothing more than that. It's not a deep investigation into nature. What's really, really deep is your heart. Now, the problem is that there are all sorts of problems with a point of view like that. You don't get to anything new. Different people who have different feelings come to entirely different versions of truth. And religious conflict, whether between religions or within the same religion, they ultimately say that the real truth is what we feel inside ourselves. And so then there's no way to resolve that conflict, because you can't change what's in somebody's heart. If by power of reason, by power of argument, you can convince one point of view to change, well, then there's hope. But no hope if your heart is in control.
A good philosopher would anticipate that exact same criticism, but Iqbal doesn't seem to address it at all. In fact, the times where he deals with science, he does not take his opponents seriously enough. He does not take science seriously enough. He does not invest the time to learn about the techniques of science, about the methodology of science, about what the science of his time really was, what scientists of his time were saying. But he very confidently critiques Einstein's theory of relativity. He very confidently name drops a few scientists and philosophers like Leibniz or Einstein and Russell, but he does not deal with their arguments. He does not deal with their ideas, and the few paragraphs where he does so is shows no engagement at all or no understanding at all of the text.
And as I pointed out in my book, he makes some really big bloopers. Like he talks about Zeno's paradox. That's a 2,000-year-old issue, but he doesn't understand it from the point of view of modern mathematics. Modern math dealt with Zeno's paradox a long time ago. All you need to do is have a basic understanding of what is continuity, what is, and that comes from the theory of sets. But he wanted to skip all of that and say that science is so fraught with problems that it's a mess of contradictions. And one scientist comes along, he overthrows all that has been known earlier, which is completely false. Science is systematic improvement in its methods, in its ideas, but the previous ones are not falsified by this, they are improved.
Uh, I want to read something that you wrote because it is interesting. So you write on scholars today contemporary scholars of Iqbal. You write that noted scholars of Iqbal, educated in the liberal arts, have nevertheless sought to outdo each other with their panegyrics, and like ordinary readers have been awed by his references to the great scientific minds of his times. And that reminded me, strangely enough, of postmodernist or the postmodern critique of science. The engagement is precisely the same. The postmodern critique of science comes from a desire to subvert everything, including reason, and claiming that reason is in fact a Western construct. And uh, Lacan's critique of mathematics and physics and all of that shows no engagement at all with actual mathematics. And Iqbal stands on the same category.
Absolutely. Now, there, I think something like 3,000 theses, PhD theses, that have been written on Iqbal. And there's nothing except praise and wonderment at what brilliant conclusions he reached at and the depth of his arguments and so forth. But they don't understand that what he's saying is scientifically doesn't make any sense at all. That he, as you said, has not engaged with uh, with the content of what people like Einstein or Newton or the Enlightenment thinkers had created. So a critique is fine, and critiques there should always be, but it's only after you understand what the person you're critiquing has actually said. And for that, a lot of investment is needed. So if you want to talk about even E equals mc squared, the simplest, most powerful equation of physics, you have to understand that it comes from very simple assumptions. One is that all observers, all inertial observers, are identical. And secondly, that the speed of light is constant. Okay, then logically from that, you reach this point. And well, taking Einstein's general relativity, that the curvature of space-time is determined by the presence of matter. Now, this is something that you need a little bit of math for. Actually, I wouldn't say a little bit, quite a lot of math, tensor calculus. You know, the stuff that's in these books behind me. You have to spend a lot of time understanding that stuff. Even if you're smart, you need to spend a lot of time before you can begin to critique. And he did not understand that. But once you decide to worship someone, well, then all logic then stands suspended. And what you said about postmodernists, yeah, it's pretty much the same stuff there. They will throw a heap of refuse of garbage onto stuff that they don't understand.
Exactly. In fact, I see Richard Dawkins in yourself, and he makes the exact same point about postmodernism, and he would agree with everything that that you're saying about science as well. Uh, so on blasphemy, uh, Iqbal's son, whom you quote, uh, writes about how Iqbal did not particularly like gore or violence, and that he could not stand the sight of goats and sheep being killed. For someone who abhorred violence, first, his poetry is filled with gore and blood and glorification of violence. And second, he supports the killing of uh, the assassination that Ilmuddin carries out by uh, an Arya Samaji who wrote a tract against the Prophet, and Iqbal says that it's a carpenter's son did what while
Uh,
we kept talking. So that is a support for a violent war act. That is support for an extrajudicial murder straight away.
Yeah, and in fact, what Javed Iqbal, his son, quotes is that Allama Iqbal said, "Oh, Tarkhan da mundia bazi lag gaya." So, saying that the carpenter's son did much more than we so-called educated people. I think that's, to me, that's shameful to uh, condone an extrajudicial killing. And this is a very sensitive matter here in Pakistan, where blasphemy is punishable by death. And although no one has been put to death officially yet, there are public lynching. The lynchings have occurred by the hundreds on allegations of blasphemy. And most of those who've been lynched have been Christians, but also Muslims as well. How Iqbal could have condoned this? Well, I think I can understand this when in his second phase. So there are two Iqbals. I call them Iqbal A and Iqbal B. Iqbal A was the humanist, was the very nice person who said, Sare jahan se acha Hindustan hamara. He was a sweet, talented poet at that time. And then this, let's say, bloodthirstiness. It wasn't really bloodthirstiness, but it was that he had to appear that way. And it's sad. All I can say is it's sad.
Particularly sad because in modern Pakistan, the blasphemy law debate is still going on, and the fact that one of the so-called co-founders of the state supported uh, an extrajudicial murder means that he would support the death penalty of blasphemy as well. It is also a terrible precedent on which to lead your people.
Sadly, that's true. But it depends on which aspect of Iqbal one wishes to emphasize, teach to kids. He is glorified. Now, just 4 or 5 days ago, there was Iqbal Day, and it was a national holiday here in Pakistan. All banks, all schools, all businesses closed for that. Now, the aspect which I heard being glorified on radio, I was driving to work, and they were the songs which were of Iqbal B. But someday I hope that it'll be Iqbal A who is glorified.
But there's also a shrine to Ilmuddin, the assassin who committed the act in Pakistan and is treated as a Sufi saint.
Yeah, it also is true for the man who who assassinated Governor Salman Taseer in 2011. He has a shrine too, and it's just something like 5 miles away from my university. Now, so when one stirs religious sentiment, and the ways of stirring it are very well known. You let the mullah on television, on radio, you let him preach whatever you want from his mosque. You don't exercise state control on it, and this is what happens. And then it then doesn't take long for the mullah to take over the state. Now, in Pakistan, the mullah has not taken over the state, but he is now one of the contenders. And this wasn't so in the earlier days of Pakistan. It wasn't so until, I'd say, pretty much Ziaul Haq had come.
So the earlier days of Pakistan were mired in ambiguity thanks to Jinnah. Uh, Jinnah is a particularly interesting case, and the argument that is made in mainstream academia, history circles, is the one that is constantly rehearsed, is through the book The Sole Spokesman by Isa Jalal. I've talked with Isa Jalal on my show. So now her argument to me, and I want to know what you think about this. Her argument to me sounds devoid of taking Jinnah at his face value because it rests almost entirely on what he did through the cabinet mission plan and ignores the whole array of statements leading up to that movement where he repeatedly emphasized on the two nation theory, promoting the fact that Hindus and Muslims cannot live together, that they have different values and different heroes, and that they are fundamentally antagonistic to each other. So, how could one reconcile the idea of a secular Jinnah with that of a Jinnah who, for the majority of his in 1930s and 40s, propagated the two-nation theory?
One must realize that Jinnah did not start out from that position. After all, way back in the 1920s, he was regarded as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. He was, and look at the Lucknow Pact and look at events subsequently, he was not communalist then. It's after, I think, the stunning defeat of the Muslim League in what are today Muslim majority areas, in what were then Muslim majority areas and are now parts of Pakistan. The fact that the Unionist Party had, which was allied to the Congress, had decimated the Muslim League. The Muslim League got just 5% of the Muslim vote, or 6-7% of the Muslim vote, something like that. Well, Jinnah then knew that politically they were finished. And so it's at that time that he started playing the communal card and started saying openly and repeatedly that religion and politics cannot be separated from each other. And he said, we are proud of it. Now, this is the very thing that he had decried earlier. Aisha Jalal, since she, I won't say that she whitewashes Jinnah, but pretty much ignores all those speeches of his where he explicitly says that religion and politics should go together. Now, she says, don't take that at face value. What should I take at face value? He didn't write any tract, no book, no position paper, and he didn't even write a draft constitution for Pakistan after it had been formed. So is one supposed to peer into Jinnah's heart to find out what he actually thought? Well, sorry, I'm not going to do that. I mean, I'm a simple-minded scientist, and I'll take people for what they say in public, not in private. In private, he might have said other things to journalists, but he said different things at different times, and there are abundant examples of that in my book.
But would you not agree that he was using the banner of Pakistan to unite the disparate sects within the Muslim community to come together and perhaps form a coherent voting bloc?
Oh, that was precisely the point, because the Muslims had so many fights amongst themselves. Shia Sunni being, of course, primary, but what does a Bori or Ismaili from Bombay have to do with a Muslim from Lahore or anywhere in Punjab. Very little. And so, he used religion. He actively used it in order to generate that coherence and make the case for Pakistan, without which Pakistan would not have been possible. That's absolutely true. But then the problem is that once you use religion and you stir up people and you say that we're going to find heaven once we are separated, then once you get the place that you wanted and fought for, then what? What's that state going to be like? And Jinnah never committed himself to the kind of state that Pakistan would be, whether it would be secular or Islamic. Islamic means run by Sharia. He said pretty much both things. He didn't say that Pakistan, he explicitly ruled out that Pakistan would be run by mullahs. But then how else are you going to implement the Sharia unless you put the mullah there in place? At the top, I mean. So,
Or what he means by
nothing.
Sharia, because when he talks about Sharia, he talks about equality, liberty, and fraternity, and how Muslims knew democracy centuries before. And also the famous statement on 14 August, where he talks about, how everyone's free to go to their temples. Their religious affairs is not the problem of the state.
Yes, he said that before the Constituent Assembly on the 11th of August, 1947, very famous speech, and it shocked his supporters in the Muslim League. They thought that, they said, why the hell have we fought for Pakistan if it's going to give equal rights to all religions over there? And they were shocked at it. But of course, he just said it once. He never repeated it. And the fact is that shortly after his death, it was completely overturned with the Objectives Resolution, which was spearheaded by Liaquat Ali Khan, who was Jinnah's right-hand man at that point. So Jinnah used religion to create Pakistan, but as I argue in my book, he didn't give it a direction. It wasn't like Ben Gurion, who gave direction to Israel. In that sense, Jinnah was a great leader, but he was not a great statesman. In fact, he wasn't a statesman. What he did was leave Pakistan in a state of eternal confusion.
That confusion continues with an existential crisis that Pakistan faces with what it really is.
Yeah, although I say that, it can find now a reason for existence. The reason is that it exists. Look, all countries in the world come into existence for some wrong reason. It's, I can't figure out, I don't know why the Netherlands is a country. It's there for some reason that, okay, now the United States, after all, it was inhabited by local tribes, by the Indians of North America. The white man came, he slaughtered them, massacred them. There was a genocide there. And you can say that the founding of the United States of America was immoral, illegal, anti-human, whatever. But now it exists. So in the same sense, I say that Pakistan exists, and so it should continue to exist.
So In the book, you talked about how Jinnah uses the terms Muslim state and Islamic state interchangeably, sometimes even in the same speech, and talking about how the existential crisis still persists now. And I would like to ask two questions. One is, first of all, in the mind of the average, say, Sunni Muslim in Pakistan, uh, would they conceive, or would their conception of Pakistan be, say, as a Muslim state or as an Islamic state? And if so, why? And another thing, if not these two, because towards the end of your book, you said that we should replace the two-nation theory with the single-nation theory. And we just talk about how it's necessary that it should be able to, the fact that it just exists and that itself should be enough reason. But where would these stem from? What would these center around?
You know, if you went out into the street over here in Islamabad and you asked if Pakistan is an Islamic state or a Muslim state, they wouldn't even know the difference. People don't think very deeply about these issues unless they're forced to. And it's really academics who like to nitpick on such things. Of course, there's a huge difference. A Muslim state is simply one where the majority of people are Muslim, and an Islamic state is one that's run by Islamic law. Now, Islamic law cannot run Pakistan. Try it and there'll be civil war over here. Because it'll be a question of whose Islam is the correct Islam. And so therefore, Pakistan has not resolved major issues that relate to statecraft. This whole country is run through banks. Everyone puts their money in banks, and banks are haram. They were haram in Islam until the Ottomans declared them halal. And this is just about 300 years ago. For the remaining time, for the remaining 1200 years, they were haram. So the issue of Islamic versus Muslim state is something that ordinary people don't think about. If you ask the ordinary Pakistani and say that, look, shouldn't everyone be equal? After all, when you go to Britain or to Sweden or wherever, and you are treated no differently from other people over there, and if you are discriminated against, you can go to the court and you can appeal and you can probably win as well. Isn't this the right thing? They would say yes. Okay, so then if you say, shouldn't that happen in Pakistan? They'll say yes. But if you ask them the question, should Pakistan be a secular state? They'll say, no. That's because secularism has been confounded, conflated with la diniyat, with atheism. And so this is the enormous confusion that exists in people's minds. You see, our people here in Pakistan are not bad people. If you explain things to them properly, then they're no different from people in Bangladesh, in India, in Sri Lanka, or whatever.
Okay. So you'd also talked about, I would like to talk about political rhetoric now, seeing as how that has such a outsized influence on, the civil society. In your book, you talked about, I'm a Pakistani, but what am I? Am I just scared of India? And we talked also about, the new single nation theory. So I was thinking of how this could possibly, play out. I was thinking of, say, there being an economic aspect to it and being a social aspect to it. I would like to talk about the social aspect first. So to put it simply, are there any signs of a visible Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb in today's Pakistan? Because I had recently taken a class on South Asia, and we talked about Islamic Dini parties in Pakistan. And we talked about intersectional denomination competition between them, and how the political rhetoric in the country is largely being shaped by Islam, these different sects claiming that your personal transformation is going to lead to larger societal transformation. But here, with of course Islam here being the vehicle for this societal transformation, and the question being about which version of Sunni Islam is, the right kind of, is the right vehicle. So when such questions are focused just on Islam, are there any signs of multiculturalness seeping in from anywhere?
Well, it's very interesting that you should ask this question at this particular point in time, because the Pakistani state is engaged in throwing out something like 2 million Afghan refugees, all of whom are Muslim. And if being Muslim was your identity and your claim to being a Pakistani, then they should be offered citizenship over here, all of them. That is not happening. It did not happen with the Biharis who fought for Pakistan in 1971 and wanted to come to West Pakistan, but the doors were closed to them over there. So this two-nation theory that Pakistan is based on Islam and Islam alone has proved to be, I could use a stronger word, but it's nonsense. It's simply not true. As a rallying cry, you could say that, but Pakistani identity being based on Islam alone? No way. Now, this is exactly why Pakistan has not gelled together. The insistence of the Punjabi establishment that they are the ones who speak for Pakistan has alienated Balochistan, Gilgit-Baltistan, Sindh, and to an extent now, and to an increasing extent, I'd say now, NWFP or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, KPK. Now, the issue with Afghan refugees is a very serious one. The police is going after them and behaving like a Gestapo. Now, these are good Muslims. They are, in fact, the ones, probably better Muslims than a lot of Punjabis, in the sense that they are far more particular as far as praying goes, as far as keeping their women in parda and so forth. But they're being thrown out mercilessly. If that's not a refutation of identity, Muslim identity, then what is?
Indeed. And also, yeah. So why is there not much more, say, social upheaval or what do you say, resistance in that sense? Because there's all the talk of religion taking primacy and being the ultimate solution, but that you don't people don't really see it playing on ground. They go through the on ground realities, but there's also the fact that there's no social justice does not really play out in Pakistan, has not played out so far as the Jagirdari system is still there. There's been little to no land redistribution system. The feudal landlords are still very much in power, and there's and there's not much welfare in that sense going on. Because, for example, in India, there's not really an what do you say, political left or right that adhere to those norms is there. Because, for example, the BJP, as Nalin Mehta puts in it, asserts in his book, The New BJP, is kind of like a saffron communist party. Sure, there's talk of, religion and Hindu nationalism, all, but this is just rhetoric with welfare and schemes like that being the real push, for people to vote for them. So, with there no being such equivalent in Pakistan, why is there not much more resistance?
Resistance to the idea of Muslim nationalism. Is that what you...
No, not just Muslim nationalism, but to the larger establishment itself. The establishment, as details, so the military, the elites, the bureaucracy, all of them.
Well, civil society in Pakistan has always been quite weak, and it became weaker with the emphasis upon religion by General Ziaul Haq. Now, what happened was that the establishment, it propagated its narrative through the educational system, and it convinced the the masses, or by and large, it sought to convince the masses that the establishment speaks for Pakistan. Then something interesting happened. Imran Khan came along, and he came on the shoulders of the army. He came because he's basically a Punjabi, speaking the language of Islamic nationalism, pro-militarism. He came out against one thing, and that was corruption and the rule of the political elite, that is Nawaz Sharif. And it suited the army at that time, and so he rose to fame. And then, when he came to power, he started deviating from what his military masters wanted him to do. He started interfering in their internal affairs, like who should be the ISI chief. Now, as a consequence of that, he fell into disfavor with the army, with the establishment. And for the first time ever, the establishment found that they had a deep split within itself. Now, the Punjabi establishment, which had been coherent all these years of Pakistan, suddenly found that there was a divide within itself, and this was serious. So what happened on the 9th of May, when the Corps commander's house was sacked and set on fire, it told the army top command that within the army, after all, there was no resistance to that, right? The troops could have been summoned ahead of time, and that didn't happen. It told the army that there was a deep problem now, that the army, the establishment which had held Pakistan together, was now in danger of fragmentation. And so that's why they have come down so heavily upon Imran Khan and his populism. So you asked if there was a challenge to the establishment, and that significant challenge in Punjab came from Imran Khan, who, as I said, had come because of the establishment and had achieved his popularity because of help from the establishment. After all those jalsas, all those dharnas were allowed and paid for by the army itself. And then there's this internal fight that happened. There have been challenges elsewhere. It's true. Balochistan still challenges the establishment. So does the TTP, the Afghan Mujahideen. The TTP and the Afghan government have no real differences amongst themselves. And so, yes, there are challenges now to the establishment, to the Pakistani establishment, from diverse directions.
Talking about a weak civil society, and we'd also mentioned Zia-ul-Haq, do you think the latter contributed a lot to the former, in weakening civil society in, say, terms of cinema? Because, for example, in your book, you mentioned that cinema has a particularly huge influence on civil society. It is one of the best multimedia formats, and it also becomes medium for political discourse and all of this. And you talked about how what it went from around 2,500 something movies being pushed out each year to substantially very lower. And so there's a lack of political discourse through cinema too. And
Yeah, cinema, but even more what's allowed on TV. Once upon a time, there were relatively good evening shows. There were dramas. There were also other educational programs, and all that has gone down. A lot of people now watch the Bollywood stuff, which I frankly despise. But yeah, if they like it, they like it. Fine, let them watch it. Um, I and then there's a lot of social media, so people are being educated through that way. In terms of artistic output, in terms of creation of new music and new dramas, that hasn't stopped in Pakistan, but it's I think the social taboos are significant.
okay. Also, I'd recently watched this documentary which was about the sexual exploitation of poor and vulnerable children in Pakistan. It talked about particularly male children. It talked about how in Pakistan, a society that is becoming where women are becoming increasingly hidden from view, and young girls are deemed pure and untouchables. So they talked about how bus station, truck stops, and alleyways have become hunting grounds for perverted men to prey on innocent young boys. And it also referred to a survey where about 95% of truck drivers admitted to having sexual intercourse with boys as their favorite pastime. And I think Imran Khan, in the documentary, there was also an interview with Imran Khan where he talked about how this is an issue that's not been addressed as well. So when things like, there's a religious orthodoxy that's giving a strong output of say about social taboos, and there being why is this issue say not addressed or talked about?
Oh, I wish it was not just talked about, but something was done about it. Now, it's well known that what happens in the madrasas is that the older boys and the tutors and the heads of madrasas, they sexually abuse the young boys over there who are helpless. Essentially, they are terrified, they're beaten, and punishment is regularly meted out over there. This is what everybody hears about, but none dare look at the magnitude of this. And certainly I do not have any figures, but sodomization of young boys is known to be very common. Now, Maulana Samyul Haq, who was a very revered leader and who called himself the father of the Taliban, was murdered in mysterious circumstances, but it is rumored, and these are strong rumors, that he was murdered by a boy who he had systematically abused for many years, and that boy who grew up to be a young man then took revenge. But of course, that whole thing has been completely suppressed.
Yeah, this creates its own vicious cycle too, doesn't it? Because in the documentary, they also talked about how these victims eventually also go on to become, say, drug addicts. And drugs are a big problem, in particular in our side of the Punjab. Punjab has an active drug problem largely due to unemployment and things like this. Is this reflected in, say, Pakistan side of the Punjab too, or larger Pakistan?
I would say probably not in Punjab, but you'll find in the cities a large number of people who have who don't have jobs, who are desperate, and they're clustered under bridges. You'll you'll find a lot of them in the outskirts of Karachi. I don't know. It needs a systematic survey, but yes, drugs is a problem. How big a problem it is, I don't know.
I wanted to talk about the national myth of Pakistan because every nation has a story, and it is that story which sort of provides its people with a narrative. So the Indian story or the Indian ideology, as Perry Anderson talks about, is that of the freedom movement or of the Congress and all of that. But the story of Pakistan is intimately tied with identity politics, with its direct opposition to India and to non-Muslims. So how do we create how do you how how is it possible to create a national myth of Pakistan that is inclusive as well as based in history?
I think it'll happen over time. But before that, we'll have to go through some wrenching disturbances. After all, the Pakistani establishment has been very unkind to the Baloch, to the Gilgit-Baltistanis, to Sindhis, and to now with the Pathans as well. So the tendency across the world is to become more inclusive. How that happens is different in different cases. But you saw after centuries of fighting in Europe that eventually there came about the European Union. Never mind Brexit, but there was, because that some okay, now we call them all Europeans. Someday they'll just call us South Asians, and then it'll carry real meaning. So technology and globalization, I should say, is a real equalizer. Right now, we are in a stage of recession where identities have sharpened instead of getting more blurred. But in time, they will blur again. I'm hopeful of that.
Do you have historical precedent for that?
Yeah, I gave you a historical precedent. Look at Europe. They're now all over pretty much the same. And they're the same as America. The West as a whole. Look at China. It's become now so much more homogenous than it was earlier. So all over the world, homogenization is taking place. Now, in places, it works the other way too. Ukraine and Russia, they're really the same people. And yet they look for small differences between one and the other and have gone to war over that.
But the question to ask would also be, if Pakistan loses its Islamic identity, then wouldn't it, uh, how would it differentiate itself from India?
Now that we have national borders and we have nuclear weapons, these borders have become sacrosanct. They're not going to change. Whatever goes on the inside will go on. Could be um, wars, famines, floods, terrible things happening. Uh, maybe even within Balochistan, there'll be fighting between the Baloch and the Pathans over there. All those things will happen. All those will be internal things, but the borders are not going to change. In time, and I say over a period of a century or so, we'll find that religious identity really works to create more fissures than to create unity. And so humanity as a whole, being guided by necessity, by pragmatic needs, will eventually need to shed that root. It's like, okay, you needed Islam to make Pakistan, but now to keep Pakistan, you don't need Islam. It's it's it can become a personal faith, but not something that is needed into the structure of the state itself.
Now that,
By the way, I must go now because it's been quite a
yes,
while.
yes. So one last question. Uh, because you sound like an optimist, so I must ask this. Do you believe, as Martin Luther King and more recently Steven Pinker argues, that the arc of history bends towards moral progress?
Well, it's obvious. Look at where we are today, compare with 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or even compare with 200 years ago. We're way better off today than we were then. It's just that we are more aware of problems because of the global media and of rapid communications. But I'd much rather live today than 100 years ago.
Professor Hoodbhoy, it was an honor talking with you. I had great fun and I learned a lot. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care and hope to see you in person sometime. All of you, both of you. Yeah.